So today I want to ask a question that almost nobody is asking, and I want to be very clear about why this question matters more than anything else we have discussed in this class so far. Everyone is focused on the war, everyone is watching the bombs fall on Iran, everyone is asking who is winning on the battlefield. Will America degrade Iran's missile program fast enough? Will Iran close the Strait of Hormuz permanently? Will ground troops be sent in? Will the Gulf states survive? These are all real questions and they are all important. But today I want to step back, I want to zoom out, and I want to ask the question that the generals and the politicians and the television analysts are too close to the action to ask. While America and Iran bleed each other, while the Gulf burns, while Europe scrambles for energy, and while the global economy convulses, who is actually winning? Because here is what I have learned from studying history. In almost every great conflict, the country that fights the hardest is not the country that gains the most. The country that gains the most is the country that positions itself correctly before the fighting starts, stays out of the direct confrontation, and then collects the prize when both sides are exhausted. And there is one country doing exactly that right now. Not loudly, not with declarations, quietly, methodically, and with a patience that the American strategic mind simply cannot understand. That country is Russia. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. You are thinking, Russia. Russia is already fighting a war in Ukraine. Russia has enormous sanctions on it. Russia's economy was struggling before this war started. How can Russia possibly be winning anything? And that is exactly the right question, because the answer is counterintuitive. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let me walk you through this carefully, because this is not opinion. This is structural analysis. This is the math of energy markets, geopolitical positioning, and what happens when the world's oil supply gets severed in the most consequential way since the 1970s. Let us start with the numbers. And the numbers are extraordinary. Before this war started, before February 28th, when the first American and Israeli strikes hit Iranian soil, Russia's oil and gas revenues had collapsed by roughly 50%. The Kremlin was draining its sovereign wealth fund. Internal Russian government officials were warning Putin that a financial crisis could hit by the summer. The Russian federal budget was built on oil price assumptions of around $60 a barrel. And Urals crude, Russia's benchmark export blend, was trading at a steep discount to global prices because of sanctions, somewhere around $50 a barrel. Then the war started, and everything changed overnight. The International Energy Agency called what happened next the greatest global energy security challenge in human history. Not since the 1970s oil shocks, not since the 2022 Ukraine crisis. The greatest in history. The head of the IEA was not speaking in hyperbole. He was reading the data. Here is what the data shows. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in early March, the world lost approximately 20% of its entire oil supply in a single moment. That is 12 million barrels per day, more than double the combined loss of both the 1973 and 1979 oil shocks combined. By March 8th, Brent crude had crossed $107 a barrel. By mid-March, it was above $119. By late March, it had surged more than 60% from February levels, the biggest monthly price gain in Brent crude since records began in the 1980s. Now think about what that does to Russia. Russian oil suddenly became the most valuable energy commodity on Earth because it was outside the blockade. It flows from the Baltic. It flows from the Black Sea. It comes from the east. It does not touch the Strait of Hormuz. And in a world desperate for any oil that is not stranded somewhere in the Persian Gulf, Russian oil went from a heavily discounted liability to a premium asset. The Kiev School of Economics calculated that Russia's oil and gas monthly revenues were expected to nearly double, rising from approximately $12 billion a month to close to $24 billion in March alone. Analysts at Carnegie estimated that the Urals crude price jumped by more than $60 a barrel compared to where it was before the Iran war. That translates to nearly $9 billion of additional revenue every single month flowing into the Russian state. Let me say that more slowly. Every month, this war continues. Russia earns approximately $9 billion more than it was earning before it started, without deploying a single soldier to the Middle East, without firing a single missile at Iran. Without spending a single ruble on this conflict, Russia is being paid to watch, and it gets more specific than that. The US Treasury, desperate to prevent global oil prices from spiraling into an economic catastrophe for American consumers, did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. It issued a 30-day sanctions waiver on Russian crude oil, allowing countries to purchase sanctioned Russian oil and petroleum products already at sea. India immediately jumped on that waiver. India's average daily imports of Russian oil jumped 82% in the first 3 weeks of March compared to February's average. Countries like Thailand and Vietnam that had been reducing their Russian oil purchases started calling Moscow again. Cargoes that had been sitting stranded on Russian tankers at sea, unable to move because of sanctions enforcement, suddenly had buyers. The discount that sanctions had imposed on Russian oil essentially collapsed. Russian Urals, which had been trading at $50, was now moving at $90, at $100, at $102 a barrel on the spot market. A Kremlin insider was quoted in a British newspaper saying this directly: "For our budget, the attack on Iran is a big plus." That is the most candid admission in geopolitics I have seen in years, because it is simply true. But here is what I want you to understand. This is not just about oil revenue. That is the surface level. The deeper strategic shift happening right now is about the entire architecture of how the world accesses energy and who it is forced to depend on. And that shift is the real prize Russia is collecting. Let me explain this carefully, because this is where it gets truly important. China's entire 5-year plan for 2026 to 2030, submitted to the National People's Congress in March of this year, contains a specific phrase that most Western analysts glossed over. It calls on China to advance preparatory work for the central route of the China-Russia natural gas pipeline. That is a direct reference to the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, a massive infrastructure project that has been stalled in negotiations for years because China held the leverage. China could choose between Russian gas and Qatari LNG or American LNG, so it had no urgency to agree to Russia's terms. The Iran war just destroyed that Chinese leverage entirely, because Qatar declared force majeure on all its LNG exports. Qatar Energy, which had been one of China's most important long-term LNG suppliers, shut down gas liquefaction because tankers could not exit the Gulf through the blockaded Strait of Hormuz. The Wall Street Journal reported that sources close to Beijing's decision-making now view the Russian pipeline as far more viable than before. Energy analysts at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy wrote explicitly that the Iran conflict increases the appeal of Russia as an energy supplier for China. Russia spent years trying to convince China to agree to the Power of Siberia. 2. China spent years stalling because it had options. Now those options are gone, and the negotiations that were dead for months are suddenly alive again. This is how Russia wins without fighting. It does not need to shoot anyone. It does not need to threaten anyone. The war in the Middle East has done something that years of Russian diplomatic effort could not achieve. It has made Russia's energy supply pipeline the most strategically necessary infrastructure project on the planet for China's energy security, and that gives Russia a leverage over China that it has never had before. Think about what that means long term. If Power of Siberia 2 gets built, Russia has a locked-in revenue stream directly to the world's second-largest economy for the next 30 years. That single pipeline could generate more stable long-term revenue than anything Russia could achieve on the battlefield in Ukraine. And China commits to that infrastructure precisely because the Iran war has demonstrated how catastrophically exposed China is to Middle Eastern maritime choke points. Now, I want to show you what is happening to the actual global energy architecture, because this matters for every country on Earth, and it explains why Russia's structural position is strengthening every day this war continues. The IEA said the crisis is arriving at an already deeply vulnerable moment for Europe. European gas storage was at historically low levels going into early 2026, estimated at around 30% capacity following a harsh winter. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and Qatar declared force majeure, Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly doubled to over €60 per megawatt hour. European gas prices soared by approximately 50% in the first weeks of the war. The continent that spent 4 years trying to wean itself off Russian energy dependency is now looking at a winter ahead with the Qatari and Middle Eastern LNG that was supposed to replace Russia gone. And Russia's pipeline gas to Europe? European sanctions prevent most member states from importing it. But as the energy crisis deepens, that political position becomes harder to hold. Hungary's Viktor Orban was already calling for the EU to suspend energy sanctions on Russia. And while the rest of Europe rejected that in March, every week of continued high prices makes that political calculation more difficult. Russia does not even need Europe to break. It simply needs the pain to continue long enough that the architecture of energy dependence on Russia, which never fully disappeared, becomes visible again as the only reliable option in a world where the Middle East cannot be trusted to keep the oil flowing. Now let me bring in the second dimension of how Russia wins. And this one is not about energy. This is about Ukraine. When the US and Israel launched their strikes on Iran on February 28th, something immediately happened in the defense supply chain that Kyiv had been dreading and Western analysts had been warning about for months. America was suddenly consuming interceptor missiles at an enormous rate in the Middle East. PAC-3 interceptors, THAAD intercept rounds. These are the exact same systems Ukraine has been begging for, the exact same systems that Europe's NATO members have been promising to send to Kyiv. Michael McFaul, the former US ambassador to Russia, said this directly in an NPR interview in early April. America is now using weapons, particularly PAC-3 interceptors that are part of the Patriot missile defense system that are in deficit all over the world. Ukraine desperately needs these interceptors. America is now using them in the Middle East instead. Think about what that does to the war in Ukraine. Russia's military-industrial complex is producing artillery shells, drones, and missiles at a rate that exceeds what Ukraine's Western suppliers can match. Ukraine's survival depended on a steady flow of high-end interceptor technology from America. That flow is now being diverted. The same interceptors that shoot down Russian missiles over Kyiv are being used to shoot down Iranian drones over American bases in Saudi Arabia. Russia planned nothing of this. It fired no missile at any American base. It deployed no warship to the Persian Gulf. But the consequence for the Ukrainian front is real and growing. Every interceptor used in the Middle East is an interceptor that does not reach Kyiv. Every dollar spent on the Gulf theater is a dollar not in the Ukraine aid package. Every political headline about Iran crowds out the congressional debate about Ukrainian defense funding. And Russia's position in Ukraine hardens without Russia having to do anything to make it happen. There is one more dimension I want to address, and this is perhaps the most consequential of all. It concerns the sanctions regime that has been the West's primary tool of pressure against Moscow. The sanctions regime that America and Europe constructed against Russia after 2022 was built on one critical assumption: that the West could use its control of maritime insurance, banking, and shipping to make it extremely difficult for Russia to sell oil above $60 a barrel. That was the G7 price cap. It was never a perfect tool, but it was a constraint. It forced Russia's oil to trade at a meaningful discount. The Iran war shattered that constraint in a single decision. When the US Treasury issued a waiver on Russian crude oil to prevent global energy prices from spiraling, it demonstrated something that cannot be undone. It demonstrated that when geopolitical necessity conflicts with sanction enforcement, the sanctions lose. America blinked. It eased sanctions on Russian oil because it had no choice. And now every country in the world that has been calculating whether it can buy Russian oil without political consequence from Washington has received its answer. The answer is yes. If the circumstances are right, Washington will not only allow it, Washington will actively encourage it. The Kyiv Independent described this bluntly. Russia was selling oil at 2.3 times the maximum allowed price under the sanctions framework. The G7 price cap of $44 was being violated in plain sight, with US Treasury authorization. Ukraine's Zelensky estimated Russia earned as much as $10 billion additional from the sanctions waiver alone. Analysts at the Kyiv School of Economics calculated that if conflict conditions persist for 6 months, Russia's annual oil and gas revenues could reach $386 billion, nearly 188% above pre-crisis estimates. So the institution of Western financial pressure against Russia is not just being strained right now, it is being publicly dismantled by the very country that built it. And that dismantling will not be easily reversed. Now, I want to step back and show you the full picture, because I do not want you to think this is simple or clean. It is not. Russia is in a complicated position. Let me give you the structural complications honestly, because that is how we do serious analysis in this class. Russia's ability to fully capitalize on the oil windfall is constrained by 2 things. First, Ukraine has understood perfectly what the Iran war means for Russia's finances, and Ukraine responded immediately. In late March, Ukrainian drones attacked Russia's top oil export hubs, Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, Primorsk, and Ust-Luga on the Baltic. According to Reuters calculations, those attacks knocked out approximately 40% of Russia's crude oil export capacity in a single week. That is the most severe disruption of Russian oil exports in the modern history of the country. Russia can earn a higher price per barrel, but if it cannot export the barrels, the higher price means less than it should. The second constraint is China. Russia's negotiating position with Beijing has improved dramatically because of the Iran war. But China is not stupid. China knows Russia needs customers. China is not going to let Russia dictate terms on Power of Siberia 2 simply because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. China will use this moment to extract the best possible price. Russia gains leverage, but China retains leverage. The pipeline negotiation will be hard and long. Russia wins more than before, but it does not win everything. But here is the crucial point. Even with those constraints, even with Ukraine striking Russian oil terminals, even with China driving a hard bargain, Russia's net strategic position in April 2026 is objectively stronger than it was in January 2026. The numbers confirm it. The geopolitical architecture confirms it. And the most damning evidence is this. America, the country that built the entire sanctions regime against Russia, just handed Moscow a financial lifeline because America's own war in Iran left it with no other option. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental shift in the balance of pressure. So let me now give you my analysis of where this leads, because understanding the trajectory matters more than understanding the snapshot. The first thing I believe will happen, and I believe this with high confidence, is that Russia uses this financial windfall to stabilize its domestic economy in ways that extend the Ukraine war timeline significantly. Before the Iran war, serious analysts inside Russia were warning of a financial crisis by summer. Those warnings are now muted. The additional monthly revenue, estimated at $9 billion, fills the budget gaps that were threatening Russia's ability to sustain military operations at current levels. The war in Ukraine does not end faster, it continues, and Russia continues it from a position of improved financial stability. The second thing I believe will happen is that the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline moves from discussion to negotiation to, within 12 to 18 months, an agreed framework. The Iran war has done what years of Russian diplomatic pressure could not do. It has created genuine urgency inside Beijing's energy planning bureaucracy. China's 5-year plan already named it. The IEA has already noted that China stands prepared for diversification away from Middle Eastern maritime routes. The deal will not be on Russia's ideal terms. China will extract concessions on price. But the pipeline will move forward, and when it does, it locks Russia into a 30-year revenue relationship with the world's largest energy consumer that insulates Moscow from future Western sanctions in ways that nothing else could. The third thing I believe will happen is that the Western sanctions regime against Russia will never fully recover its pre-Iran war credibility. The waiver the US Treasury issued in March was not a small technical measure. It was an admission that American strategic interests can override American financial pressure on Russia when the circumstances are extreme enough. Every adversary of the United States has now updated its model. Sanctions can be waited out if the adversary can survive long enough for America to face a crisis that makes easing them politically necessary. Russia has proven this works, and Russia will use that proof as a template. Now, I want to address the question I know many of you are asking. You are thinking, if Russia is winning this, does that mean Russia planned this? Did Putin want this war? The honest answer is no. Russia did not plan the Iran war. It did not orchestrate the American strikes on February 28th. Iran and America made their own decisions based on their own calculations and their own strategic failures. What Russia did was something different. Russia positioned itself correctly years in advance. It built an energy architecture that does not depend on the Strait of Hormuz. It built a military partnership with Iran that ensures Tehran's resilience. It built the BRICS economic framework that provides an alternative payment system when Western sanctions bite. And it developed the intelligence and satellite sharing relationships that allowed it to provide Iran with real-time data on American warship positions, something that Iran's own foreign minister Abbas Araghchi did not deny in a televised interview, saying only that military cooperation with Russia and China continues. Russia did not start this fire, but Russia had spent years positioning itself next to the heat source. And when the fire started, Russia was the only country in the world that was warm. Let me bring in the historical parallel because this is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. And I want to use a specific example, not a general one, because specific examples are how we test analysis rather than just assert it. It is 1904. Japan and Russia go to war, a war that Russia's military command assumed it would win easily. Russia had a larger army, a larger navy, a more established empire. Japan had been modernizing rapidly since the Meiji Restoration, but was still considered a secondary power. What most histories do not focus on is what America did during that war. America, under Theodore Roosevelt, stayed out of the direct fighting. It offered to mediate. It positioned itself as the rational third party. And when the war ended, with Japan's surprising victory, America had gained significant influence in the Pacific by doing almost nothing militarily. Roosevelt even won the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the Treaty of Portsmouth. Roosevelt understood something that the generals who were fighting did not understand. The country that chooses the right moment to engage, rather than charging in first, sets the terms of the peace. Russia understands this now, not because Putin read Roosevelt's biography, but because Russia has been forced by years of Western pressure to develop a patience and a strategic indirectness that comes from having fewer options. When you cannot match America's carrier strike groups, you learn to play a different game. And the different game Russia is playing right now, positioning as the indispensable energy supplier, strengthening the BRICS architecture, locking in the China partnership, converting the Ukraine sanctions waiver into long-term credibility damage. That game is working. America started a war. Russia is winning a peace. Now let me be direct about what I am not saying. I am not saying this outcome is just. I am not saying Russia's conduct in Ukraine has been acceptable. I am not saying Vladimir Putin is admirable. None of that is the analysis. The analysis is structural. It is about which country's position is stronger at the end of this process than at the beginning. And on that question, the facts are clear. America entered this war believing that its military dominance would translate into strategic dominance. It is discovering again, as it discovered in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, that military dominance and strategic success are not the same thing. America can destroy targets. It cannot control consequences. Russia entered this period under sanctions, under financial pressure, losing credibility in some parts of the world, and fighting an exhausting land war in Ukraine. It is discovering that the crisis America created in the Middle East has relieved several of its most serious structural pressures simultaneously: the revenue crisis, the sanctions enforcement ceiling, the Chinese negotiating advantage, without requiring Russia to risk a single soldier in the Gulf. That asymmetry is not small. It is not temporary. It is structural. And structural advantages compound over time. So let me give you the prediction. Here is where I think this ends, based on everything we have analyzed today. Prediction 1. Russia's oil and gas revenues, if the conflict continues at current intensity through the second quarter of 2026, will reach levels that effectively neutralize the financial pressure that sanctions had been building since 2022. The budget crisis that was threatening to force uncomfortable choices on Putin by summer will not materialize. Russia sustains its Ukraine operations without the domestic financial crisis that Western planners were counting on to force a negotiated settlement. Prediction 2. The Power of Siberia. 2 pipeline moves from the 5-year plan language it appeared in this March into active bilateral negotiation within 6 months. The Iran war has done the work that years of Russian diplomacy could not do. It has created genuine Chinese urgency. The deal will be signed within 18 months of the war's end, on terms substantially more favorable to Russia than what China was offering in late 2025. Prediction 3. The Western sanctions framework, which was already showing cracks before this war, will not recover its pre-2026 credibility in the eyes of the global South. The March waiver demonstrated that American sanctions enforcement is ultimately subordinate to American strategic convenience. That lesson, learned by every country watching, accelerates the de-dollarization trend that BRICS has been building. Yuan-denominated oil contracts, ruble-rupee swaps, alternative payment systems. Russia benefits from every percentage point of that shift. Now, am I certain about these predictions? No, nothing in geopolitics is certain. The Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian export infrastructure are real, and they are damaging. Oil prices could fall if a ceasefire in the Gulf comes faster than expected. Trump has already signaled that American forces will leave Iran in a matter of weeks, which would relieve some of the price pressure. Russia's ability to export at full capacity is genuinely constrained by the terminal damage Ukraine has inflicted. But here is the point. Even in the most optimistic scenario for America, a quick ceasefire, oil prices returning toward normal, Iran's position weakened. Russia still keeps the financial windfall it already collected. Russia still keeps the leverage it already gained with China. Russia still keeps the sanctions credibility damage that the waiver already inflicted on the Western financial pressure campaign. The downside scenarios narrow. The structural gains remain. I want to leave you with one final thought, because this is what I believe is most important to understand. The lesson of this moment is not that Russia is brilliant and America is stupid. The lesson is older than that. It is the lesson that empires that are overextended, that fight wars in multiple theaters simultaneously, that are so confident in their military dominance that they stop thinking clearly about strategic consequences. Those empires create vacuums, and other powers fill those vacuums quietly, methodically, and without having to fire a single shot in the theater where the vacuum was created. America is fighting in the Gulf, Russia is collecting in the North, not as adversaries on the same battlefield, as parties playing different games entirely. And one of those games, Russia's game, does not require winning battles. It requires surviving long enough for the other side's battles to produce the right conditions. The International Energy Agency called this the greatest energy security challenge in history. The Kremlin insider called it a big plus. Both statements are true simultaneously. And that is what it looks like when one country wins a war it was never fighting. This is not prophecy. This is structural analysis. This may be wrong. If it is, we will come back and examine why together. Because the goal is never to be certain. The goal is to think carefully, follow the evidence, and see the logic before the headlines do.